So I touched on this in a recent Sava webinar, and I thought I'd just take the opportunity to expand on it slightly. This relates to what the colour and shape of dampness or mould can tell us, or might tell us, about the mechanism, as in how it's got to that area. So using a few visual examples, the first one that we've got is dark coloured mould that's settled but in an abnormal shape, so not around what we'd expect of a normal thermal bridge. And what this normally tells us is that the area above this, at the very minimum, the loft insulation has been disturbed or not placed correctly in the first place, or it could be that the loft insulation above is damp and wetted. But either way, it tells us we need to be looking at the loft insulation above this area, or if there's a room above, possibly what the condition of that is, if there's a leak perhaps that's wetting the boards. The next one, the shape and size of the mould in the corner, tells us that it's probably related to a cooler external wall, and we can see a footprint of furniture. When mould follows the exact shape and size of an item of furniture, it normally tells us that the mechanism is probably from inside the room. And again, sometimes what you might find looking at this next photo, that the mould actually forms on the back side of the furniture instead of, or as well as, any mould on the walls as well. But in this next example, what we've got is mould that's showing in the corner of an outhouse. It's kind of a lean-to, it's not a formal part of the building. And it would be easy to look at this and maybe assume that it's a normal thermal bridge because it is in an external corner, but this is to demonstrate the importance of actually checking what's going on the outside rather than jumping to conclusions. And what we can see here is that there's actually quite a poor detail to the very edge of this pitched roof structure. We can see that there's almost kind of a valley or an internal gutter, and the detailing is very, very poor. But when we move on to the next one, this is an example of this tea-coloured stain I talked about in that last webinar. And the tea-coloured stain normally is an indication that the mechanism of dampness is that it's passed all the way through the ceiling material and it's brought some of the plaster minerals with it. So using this one as a real-life example, this is one that I've been to recently. We can see that classic tea-coloured staining, and it's typically darker right around the edges. This is just where the clean water evaporates away and it leaves all the contaminants, so normally plaster minerals. When we go above this area, what we can see is that the insulation material is clearly wetted, and when we pull that insulation material away, what we can see is that the ceiling board is wetted above this area, almost in exactly the same shape and size as the staining that we can see below. That's the mechanism, but of course it's important to understand the cause, and in this particular case what we could see is that in the area directly above this there weren't any obvious roof leaks, there wasn't any staining to the felt or the timbers, but what we could see is that the extractor fan ducting had become detached. So you can kind of see it in this photo, but what that then meant is that it was completely open, but that wasn't what we thought was the exact cause. Normally there's a reason that the ducting becomes detached, and quite often if you have any sort of kink in the ducting, it can fill with water, eventually gain so much weight that it falls, and then all of that water that's built up in the ducting can then splash onto the floor and cause this isolated issue. And in this case actually there was also an issue with the electrics in this bathroom, so we did flag it as a possible risk that the water that had spilled out of this extractor fan ducting could also have damaged the electrics in the area. In this next example, we've got very faint staining showing on a ceiling, on a landing, and we've got a roof void above it. And when we go directly above this area, what we can see is that the roof boarding and also some of the timbers are clearly wetted. And we're going to follow the trail upwards. What we can actually see, the most obvious cause, is that we can see some corrosion to the copper pipework, and we can see a clear trail of water running down the outside of the insulation around this the water tank that's in the loft. And a little bit closer we can see that green staining that we'd typically see if there's some sort of minor leak, possibly condensation, but it's difficult to tell. This property had been empty for a little while. And although the visual indicators were fairly clear, we've also tested the roof timbers just to demonstrate those are dry. That's a very unlikely cause for this dampness that we can see. Then moving on, we've got this example of some green staining and also some decorative damage, and this is actually to the ceiling of an external balcony area. And it's unusual to see green staining rather than the tea coloured staining that we've talked about before, or general dark mould staining. And that tells us again something a little bit more about the mechanism. Number one, how it's got there and what it's passed through to get there. This is clearly a penetrating dampness issue. From an external view, this is really hard to see just because this is a 3-storey house and the garden is sloped downwards, but from ground level you can see some sort of defect to the roof tile. But it was possible to see it much clearly using a camera pole, or ideally a drone would have been perfect in this scenario. So we can see the defect, but let's have a look in the roof space just so that we can see that mechanism and understand why that green staining is there. And this property, once we get right into the eaves, just below the area where we can see the defect and above the area where we can see the symptom, what we can see very clearly is that there is this big gap that we could see from the outside. But what we can see is actually all the moss from the roof has fallen down in through the open roof tile, and also where the felt's rotted because of this leak. It's filled with moss, and then we can see that then that green from the moss is then tracked all the way through to the underside of the ceiling, which is why we're seeing that green staining. So just to reiterate the point, we've got here a property that I've been to recently, and we can clearly see that there's staining on the ceiling. We can see that classic tea coloured stain that tells us that the mechanism of dampness is that it's come through the ceiling rather than being a surface issue. We don't really need to test it, but we can see just on the corner where you've got the brown stain, you've also got some kind of greenish mould. You could just touch it and it would be damp to the touch, but I've tested it so we can see relatively how damp it is. And if we go up into the roof void above this area, we can see what's going on. Whilst I'm just making my way over there, what I'll also explain is there's not actually any apparent roofing defects on the outside in terms of any slipped or loose or cracked tiles. It's concrete tile, but there is quite a lot of moss that's become quite embedded between the tiles, and that can allow water to track through. So that would be my advice for the clients in this case. But once we get above this area, we can see very clearly it is damp above there. Most of it is just dampness, and you can see that will then allow water to pass through. We can see in a few different areas, not all of it has actually penetrated right through to the ceiling board above, and some of it is covered by insulation, but this particular area is where the worst issues are. And I'm slowing down here just because I noticed there was a drip, and you can see it come down there. So you can see the general damp patch, and then we've got a splash zone, and it's actually in the splash zone we've got this green mould that's settling on the top in that damp but not wet area, and it's where the water's coming through there that green mould that we can see here is actually transferring through as it passes through the whole ceiling board to the underside. So again, it's just a reiteration that what we can see mechanism wise shows on the other side, and it gives us an indication this isn't condensation, this is a roof leak.